Britain in the 1930s was not always a happy place to be. The country faced economic hardship. Many battled with unprecedented levels of poverty, and the policymakers of the day were preoccupied with one central and crucial question: should Britain rearm her once mighty military ahead of what many believed would be a second Great War with Germany? Yet, despite this ongoing sense of foreboding, the months of 1936 were dominated by a question that seemed almost trivial. The newly installed king, Edward VIII, had fallen in love with the soon-to-be twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, and he was determined to become husband number 3. In this debut season of our brand new podcast, we explore the abdication crisis, attempting to reconstruct events from available source material and solve the many mysteries that surround Britain's most recent royal revolution.
Hello, Royal History Geeks, and welcome to Royal Revolutions Season 1, Episode 9, where we are, I suppose, concluding, really, our series on the abdication crisis. My name is Gareth Streeter. I am the creator of Royal History Geeks, and I am joined by Royal commentator James Taylor. Good morning, James. How are you today?
Sad that this series is at an end because it's been such a joy to be able to examine this, to engage with people, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the questions that they've come up with.
I completely agree. Just to say on this series, this is the last, for now, formal episode of Season 1, or probably is the last episode of Season 1. There are going to be some further episodes where we talk and reflect about the character and lives of Edward VIII and Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. They will be released as bonus episodes, which I don't think makes any difference to how you, as listeners, will experience them. But it technically means I'll probably try and put some background music on the back or something like that, so they'll feel a bit different. They'll have more of a saloon, gentle, relaxed feel, as opposed to the hard-hitting timber of these podcast episodes. So we have got an array of very interesting questions that you have kindly sent in to us. So I don't really see much point in delaying, diving in and getting on with them. Oh, first of all, I should ask, I've asked you how you are, haven't I, James? I've already done that.
You have, yes. And how are
Perfect.
you?
Oh, I am fine. I'm fine. I am energized and ready to go. And that's the best we can hope for.
Well, let's dive in then.
Okay, so our first question is from Catherine, who is a friend of Royal History Geeks and who interviewed James and I in a bonus episode about this series. So it's quite right that we should take Catherine's question first, but I also think hers is a great scene-setting question. So she has asked the following: given what we would later learn about the character of Edward VIII, should we call the events of 1936 the abdication crisis, or should we call it the abdication relief? I.e., is it something we should be grateful for? Do you want to go first, James?
Ooh, that's a hard-hitting question to begin with, isn't it? In some ways, we probably should, because it is, I think, undoubtedly a relief that you had the departure of a monarch who was seen to be not conscientious in the same way that his father had been, in the same way that his brother and his niece proved to be. I think also it's a relief that you didn't then have a monarch during the Second World War who was known to have fascist sympathies. I think that would have been extremely difficult. And look at the state of European monarchies where there had been sympathies for Germany, but in both First and Second World War, and the difficulties that brought to them. So I think all of those things are a relief. But equally, I like to try and think that as historians, we should rise above putting such value judgments on names like that. And so but having said that, I suppose crisis is just as much of a value judgment, isn't it?
Well, it is, and also there's, yes, as a historian, but you're also a British subject that has grown up in the aftermath of events that came before you, and I think that's probably the two separations I would make in looking at this question. So I think as a British subject whose grandparents were alive in World War II, I think we absolutely should be grateful that the abdication crisis happened. Because, well, put it this way, if Edward VIII had remained on the throne, had he acted as king in the way he acted as an exiled former king in World War II, it would have significantly undermined the British war efforts to an extent that could have affected the outcome. Put it that way. Now,
Very true.
whether he would have, we don't know, because we don't know whether some of his betrayals, if you want to use that language, of the country were born out of a sense of rejection. So we don't know. But
No.
in that sense, I'm grateful. The only point I would say about why I would be reluctant not to call it the abdication crisis is because we know because we later would find out these really very worrying things about Edward VIII, and obviously his fascist sympathies are the most worrying of all. A narrative has built up that the abdication crisis had nothing to do with Wallace Simpson. It was just an excuse to get the king out. Now, that is true in the sense that probably people, including the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, recognised that if it weren't for something like Mrs. Simpson, there probably might be another issue that would come up that would force a conflict between Crown and government. And actually, for all the problems with the king marrying a twice divorced woman, there was also something quite sellable about it, because even people that disapproved could acknowledge that it was a very human affair, even once he had gone, not if he'd stayed, but once he had gone. However, it is very clear from the sources at the time that the abdication was not what the government wanted. Their first, right up until the end, their first choice would always have been that the king would give up Mrs. Simpson and stay. So it really wasn't a case that they were trying to get him out. They wanted him to stay. They didn't want to be blamed for a popular king leaving. So in the context of 1936, it was a crisis.
Yeah, and you picked up on a very important point there, because that's why you still
I
get.
generally do.
Of course, you always do.
Yeah.
But that's why, almost 90 years later, you have that narrative being put out by the campaign group. I'll say that again, just so you can bleep it out. The campaign group, who have this whole narrative. You look at their website, you can see that there are pictures of Edward with Hitler, and it is all around. The narrative is all about his relationship with Hitler, with Nazis, with fascism, and that is why he left. And Wallace is nothing more than a footnote in that. If you read their version of events, you would see that Wallace virtually didn't exist. It was all about that. Whereas, if you look at sources from around the time and a little bit later, I mean, I always remember Elizabeth Longford, the biographer of Queen Victoria, giving an interview, and she said that when they heard the speech that Edward made on his abdication, that they couldn't believe that there was the king using the same sort of language that you would hear in women's magazines about finding it impossible to carry on without the woman that he loved. And so I think that on the one hand, you can see it as a very human crisis, but you can also then read far too much into the political side of it as well. And I think we have to, as historians, you have to try and remember that balance and that light and shade.
I think it's just people find it so hard to understand why marrying a twice divorced woman was a problem, in the same way that people think it must have been about something else. Then, of course, other sources emerged to show there were lots of other problems too. People say, well, it must have been those things. But that's not the best reading in my view. I took a very understandable reading, but it's not the best reading of 1936 in my view. One point that you stumbled across, James, I suspect quite by accident, but is a good point that is worth drawing out. A few people have said to me on social media when I've been posting clips of this, Edward VIII wasn't that bad. All of this stuff that's come out since is a smear campaign by the royal family trying to discredit him and trying to discredit Wallace. And that I understand why people might say that, but that completely misunderstands the context in which these records have come to light, because there was some interference by possibly the royal family and certainly the British government around these sources, but that was to try and cover them up, not to try and expose them, because the calculation that people have always made is that, and I don't think this would be so true now, but I think would have been true in the decades after the war, that anything that comes out about the Duke of Windsor and his fascist sympathies and his potential fascist assisting activities would do more harm to the royal family than it would do good. So it would be more of a sense of, jeepers, we shouldn't have people like this, in positions of responsibility. We've got to control this. We've got to get rid of the lot of them, rather than, aren't we lucky he has gone? So it is not really a credible argument to say that these sources have all been engineered to try and make the royal family look good, because the whole policy toward them has been keep them under wraps as much as it's possible to do so. And I think, and that's, as you say, and of course, who are the people that make most use of them? It's the campaign group that shan't be mentioned, who recognise that this is a worse story for the monarchy than it is a good one.
Very true, and I think that's why they use it in the way that they do.
Yes. We should probably move on to the next question, but Catherine, that was a brilliant starter question for us. So we got a couple of questions from Gail through the Discord group. And the first one was Wallace actually that bothered about Edward? It all seems rather one-sided. This is a great question, because I don't think that James and I necessarily fundamentally agree on this. I think we may have a slight, not major disagreement, I think we maybe slightly see it differently. So do you want to go first with your incorrect interpretation before I come in with the corrective one?
Oh, I've no choice now, have I? I think it is one-sided. I'll surprise you and say that I think it is one-sided. I think that he was far more into her than she was him. I think that he did have a sort of controlling way about him, and certainly in their later married life. Because I was spoken before about having read back to their fascist friends, read Diana Mosley's biography of the Duchess of Windsor, and although we'll talk about books in a moment, but although you can't entirely take what she says at face value, I think that because she was somebody who knew them fairly well and was in their social circle, went to events that they were at, she did observe them together a lot. And she writes about how he would say, "Oh, where's the Duchess? I must tell the Duchess this," if she wasn't actually in the room at the time. And so I can imagine that would have been quite suffocating, quite stifling. But Diana also makes this argument that she has to be credited for in the last 30 odd years of his life that she acted to make him happy, and that she did. So I would imagine that there were my reading of it is that she had a degree of affection for him, that there was this sort of very jocular teasing when you see them in interviews, which is possible that belies some deeper emotional resentment, possibly, but I still think that there was enough of an affection between them for that marriage to have lasted in the way it did.
I guess if I was Wallace Simpson, I would probably hope that my greatest offender wasn't the mother of British fascism.
Well, the wife
this,
of.
but as in the mother of the movement.
Yes, I know what you mean.
I mean, I don't want to do that whole thing of saying just because someone had bad politics, their whole authority as a source is undermined, because I don't believe that. And I think you have to, with everybody, you have to look at each claim on its own basis. I think my take is, I guess what I'm saying is, for Diana Mosley, it's in her best interest that they all come out of this quite well. In that she's not a totally uninvested witness, but nobody ever is.
No, she isn't. And I think the other important thing to say is about Diana and her biography in particular is that Diana is, because she has a certain, because obviously there's the political edge to it, and so because she had a particular antipathy towards Stanley Baldwin, Baldwin is painted in a particularly negative light, and so
Yes.
therefore Edward is seen in a more positive light.
Mm.
And so that part of that relationship and of that in the biography, I tend not to focus on and tend not to try and draw too many judgments on, because I think that there is too much of a bias there. But where I do think Diana is probably a slightly more reliable witness is in the sort of personal, the intimate moments of Edward and Wallace, certainly post the abdication, when they were living in the same valley in Paris and would go to the same social events and would be invited around, because you have those eyewitness accounts, which I think you don't have from very many other people, because if somebody is in exile, you don't then tend to get that many people going to visit them. So it is a valuable source in that regard. But again, I think that you have to read it within that context. You have to do your source criticism,
Yes.
and I would not accept it as an unbiased source. I just think that it offers you a flavour of their personalities that you don't tend to see elsewhere.
Yes, I think, and I think the nature of being an exile is the only people that meet you are probably your friends, which
Yeah,
is both helpful and unhelpful, but as with all sort of sources. I think my take, and it's always difficult with this because it's very difficult, and I always say it's very difficult to know what your best friends truly think about each other, say if they're a married couple, let alone someone you've never met who lived, well, she didn't live decades before I was born in the, I think she was probably, what year did she die, Wallace?
Wallace,
Yeah.
1986.
No, yeah, so I was born in 82. So she was still around when I was born, but you know what I mean. The main sort of heyday of her life was before my time. So it's very difficult to guess at what someone was really thinking. But I would say that my read is the nature of their relationship seems to have been, and again, the source material, no, and the source material with no one is impartial, but with Wallace and Edward, it's all particularly partisan in some ways. It seems to me that their dynamic was one of a sort of sadomasochistic dominance, where she seemed to give him something in a authoritarian way that he seemed to love and respond well to. And that probably belied the fact that on a on a bigger, broader level, he was probably the one in control, because he was ultimately the figure of most power in outside the context of their relationship. I think she'd been interested in him initially for what he could do for her in terms of money. I think she'd been open to the idea of marriage, even open to the idea of queen, because it would give her the financial security and social status that she had wanted. But what she didn't want was that at any cost. She didn't want all the fuss and drama of the abdication crisis, and she absolutely did not want to be vilified as the wicked woman that lured the king away, which she knew full well would be exactly how everybody would read the situation. And Edward didn't realise that, and Wallace did. I think thereafter, I think she was decent enough to know she had to stick with him, but I don't think she did have a great deal. Again, how can I know? I don't think she did have a great deal of love or affection for him. There are also accounts later of her being incredibly rude to him in public, him crying himself to sleep, although he seemed to sort of like that too. What I would say, though, there are also accounts, including in her own voice and interviews you can watch, where she does defend him after. Like, she's on record as saying she thinks it's terrible that after he abdicated, he was just left to fend for himself and no one even sort of booked him a flight, kind of thing. And he had to do all that himself. And later, we talked about this last week, how the royal family didn't give him the friendly welcome he should have had. She talked about how he wasn't given jobs, even though he was good at the jobs he'd been given, which he was not good at. So there is, I guess that's an affection, a protection. There's something, but I think he was obsessed with her in a way that's both romantic and in a way that's scary. And I think she'd have been quite happy if their relationship ended after the summer of 1936 and she had stayed married to Ernest Simpson.
Mm. And that, to be fair to Diana Mosey, in her reading of it, is something that she says, that she didn't want the marriage or to be queen or all of that. She just wanted to have had this relationship with him. And so that although that's as far as she says, you can read into that Wallace had got herself into a situation that she wasn't really prepared for. So I think, yeah, I think we've got some common ground there, but I think
Yeah.
that I wouldn't go so far as to say that she went on to really dislike him or resent him. I think that I still would say that they stayed together because there was not just because she was afraid of him, but because she liked the lifestyle that he brought her. And also, you mustn't forget that they could have split up and she could have had a very generous divorce settlement if things had been
Yeah.
as if there'd been that level of antipathy between them. So that's where I
Mm.
tend to think that it probably wasn't as far as that.
Well, this is something I think we'll explore more in the reflection episodes because, in a sense, they've not been that relevant to the substance of the podcast. But there is a read of Wallace and Edward's relationship, which puts it quite far on the sort of BDSM spectrum in terms, and then lots of talk later that there was wider sexual activities involving other people that was brought
Mm.
into that. I don't know the truth of that, but I think I'm probably slightly more inclined than James to view it toward that end of the spectrum, whereas I think James, because he's a figure of such light and purity, sees it more on the sort of PG end of the spectrum, possibly.
Well, anyway, moving on.
um, Another question from Gail is, can you recommend any good books on the application crisis? Well, there's lots of books and many of them very good. So in terms of the books that we have drawn heavily on from for this series, one, in terms of the secondary sources, The Crown in Crisis by Alexander Larman, which I'm going to hold up, but I don't know if you'll actually see it. And obviously, if you're listening to this on a podcast channel, you won't see it. But you might be able to see it if you're watching on YouTube. Probably not because my screen's blurred. And it's a very, very good book. It makes use of archival material that hadn't previously been open to more recent years. So it's probably the most up-to-date, more scholarly rundown of what's going on. All I would say is, as I've encountered other sources, Larman writes incredibly well. He's a very good writer as well as a good historian. And the way you write well is you take a very strong angle and you deliver that consistently through your work. And he has gone in very strong on Edward and Wallace. Were not just horrible people, they were pretty untalented, uninspiring. There's nothing really to commend them. And it makes for a pretty good read because he's pretty open about his take, and therefore you can take it or leave it. As I have gone on, so I think that's the best book, is what I'm trying to say. As I've, however, gone on and read other things, I think that there are parts of Wallace and Edward's characters that Larman has undersold. And I think that needs to be readdressed with other reading. Another great book is The King Who Had to Go by Adrian Phillips, who's helped us with this podcast. Again, it's a great summary. A little bit, again, quite harsh read on both of those, but it's quite difficult to not take quite a harsh read on both of those. And is well worth reading. In terms of other, this is less about the application crisis and more about what comes next. But The Traitor King by Andrew Loney is a controversial book, but it's good. I think needs to be weighed against more sympathetic readings. And then in terms of a more sympathetic reading, the best thing to probably go to is the Duke of Windsor's own account, which is his take on it. Much is clearly redacted, and that makes sense. But there is also a lot that can be verified and established by other sources in terms of the broad chronology and the broad timelines of things. And then, of course, James, you've read Diana Mosley's work on Wallace as well.
Yeah, and you can also, if you look on YouTube, you can find an interview that Diana Mosley gave to Russell Harty in 1980 when that book was published. And so that's quite interesting, her talking about having written it and her motivations for writing it. It's to give you a spoiler, she thought about that somebody ought to write a sympathetic biography of them, but that she didn't have that thought herself. Somebody else put that into her mind because she was asked to do it, and then it crystallized the thought that she should. And also, I think another one which is interesting, which we've not talked about a lot, but is more interesting in the aftermath of the abdication crisis, is Richard Wallace's book, The King's Loot, looking at the greatest royal jewellery heist in history, looking at Wallace's jewellery collection, where it might have come from, because there's a lot of speculation that Edward had taken jewellery from the royal vaults, certainly uncut stones which belonged to Queen Alexandra, his grandmother, and that they'd ended up with Wallace. So that's an interesting read. And the other thing that I would say is that we've also drawn a bit on biographies and autobiographies of other members of the royal family. So there was Princess Alice's autobiography, which gave an interesting insight into both the night that Queen Mary was told about the abdication crisis, and also when she spoke about having met the Windsors after the war and the backlash that they received. And again, with Elizabeth Basford's book, we talked to Elizabeth earlier in the series about Mary, Princess Royal. And again, that gave, because she had quoted extensively from Mary's correspondence with Edward and with other members of the family about Edward, that gave a real insight into the royal family's reaction and their relationship with him.
In terms of a slightly more positive take on Edward VIII, it's worth checking out The Lost Memoir of Edward VIII, Once a King, by Jane Marguerite. I hope I pronounced that right. Jane Marguerite Tippett. This is an interesting book because it effectively explores Edward VIII's memoirs and the notes that she has managed to access in an archive that contributed toward the memoirs. And while I think she is too dismissive of the evidence against Edward in terms of things like his Nazi sympathies or fascist sympathies, in the way that I think she defends him too freely, what she has helped make me realize is, at an earlier stage, I was dismissing Edward both as a man of great character, a man of bad character, and a man of no real talent or skill or with anything really to offer. I've gone down quite a negative train of thought. This book helped me realize actually he was far more involved, for example, in the writing of his memoirs than people have given credit for. And actually, when you think about that, actually, when you look at his TV interviews, he was gifted. He could connect well. He did have a charisma. And that's something that the others often underplay and say, oh, no, actually, yeah, people said that, but really it was just him being clumsy and people liked, oh, whatever. Whereas, so I think there's, with reading some of the more sympathetic accounts, what you at least come to is a sense that not that he was someone that made a great contribution to humanity, but maybe in a different context he could have been, and he did have gifts. For a more sympathetic account of Wallace, you could try The American Duchess from Anna Pasternak. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. And there are others as well. There's a lot of ink being spilled on these two, but hopefully that gives you something of a flavour. So, next question from John on YouTube, where he says, is it accurate that King George V said that his son was bound to ruin himself somehow in the end? So I actually, because this we talked about this on the podcast, there's basically two quotes that are often attributed to George V, but they're often just quoted with no one really giving the source, and they both sound a little bit too good to be true. So one is George V saying, after I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. And the second is him saying, I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne. Bertie was his second son, who became George VI. Lilibet was his granddaughter, who became Elizabeth II, which again seems incredibly prophetic. I spent quite a lot of time trying to dig around. Can we actually find sources for these quotes? Because they weren't really in the scope of the podcast. They're relevant, but they're chronology wise, they're obviously before we really start digging into the substance of the podcast. And it would seem that the first quote, after I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months, that's verifiable. And that's a letter to Stanley Baldwin in either 1934 or 1935. I've found different dates for both. I haven't read the letter itself, but it is at the Cambridge Archives, so people could go and read it. And that is verifiable. There's an irony that, of course, Stanley Baldwin would then be the man dealing with Edward VIII. So if it's just that Stanley Baldwin was going around saying, "Oh, do you know what? The late king told me this would all happen. He predicted it," you'd have to be really cautious about verifying it as a true statement. But the fact it exists in letter form, big caveat, I've not read the letter myself with my own eyes, means I think we can take it more seriously. Often, when you see that quote, the second quote, "I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry," etc., is often written by writers as if he said both at the same time. Now, because I haven't seen this letter, I cannot tell you whether or not that's true. And hopefully, maybe one day I'll go to Cambridge and I'll look in the archive, although you probably need a better reason than just because I want to go and do that. But it with this second quote, I've only ever been able to find references to where it's referenced in other biographies, so it's circular. If I had more time, I might be able to find and verify an original source. But I would say quote number one, verifiable, good. Quote number two, entirely believable and credible in the context of what we know, but I can't find a verified source for it. If anyone can, please let me know.
No, in the same way that we can't find a verifiable source about George V's last words, because they are, again, are variously reported as being wildly different. So you can't, I think it is very different. Well, either that or how is the empire?
Right.
Because that was what was reported at the time. So I think that you have to take a note of caution when you're looking at these things, especially because they are that bit too convenient. And also, I think that, yes, it is verifiable that he said, "After I'm dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months." But I think you can read too much into that as well, because is he talking directly about, because he knows about Edward and Wallace, is he talking about knowing that there is an unsuitable relationship, or is it just a general sense of exasperation with his son, which had been simmering for many years? And I would tend to lean towards the latter.
And presumably some of that context exists in the rest of the letter, because I doubt very much that he just wrote down on a piece of paper, "The boy will ruin himself in 12 months. And
dear
sent it to
Prime
Stanley
Minister,
Baldwin.
dear Prime Minister, my son will ruin himself within 12 months. Love and kisses, King. I don't know. I don't think that is very likely.
And I'm not even sure Stanley Baldwin was Prime Minister then, was he? Depending on when it was, because there's, as I say, I found two different dates. Again, I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to really check, because this will be known. There is a letter there that will give us all of this information. But if it's a 1934 date, then Stanley Baldwin wasn't Prime Minister when he wrote that letter, which suggests that it's just a confidence sharing. Whereas if it's 1935, which is perhaps more credible, and he is Prime Minister, then you could imagine it will be a correspondence about a number of issues, and it's just one of the things that he mentioned. But presumably that letter itself would give us some context, and it's a shame that biographies only quote that snippet, but that's so often the way. Next question from Michelle. We've got two or three actually from Michelle on YouTube, which she asked, did Wallace equate meeting the Prince of Wales, so this has been back when they first met, with seeing the Tower of London, i.e. was it initially just about the thrill and the ability to brag? What do you think, James?
No, I think that it was more significant in Wallace's mind. Certainly, when you've heard her talk about it in retrospect, that would seem to suggest that it was quite a frivolous meeting, and I think it did. I think it did mean more to Wallace. I think that even though you and I have both throughout this series, I think, developed a more sympathetic and empathic view of Wallace, I think that you have to bear in mind that she was a social climber. She was quite grasping, which is not intended to be too much of a criticism, because there were a lot of people who were like that at the time, who would have moved in those circles and tried to get an introduction to the Prince of Wales. But I don't think it was a frivolous, "Oh, isn't it marvelous to meet the Prince of Wales?" I think it was intended to be, "I want to meet the Prince of Wales. I want to get involved in these society functions so I can be introduced to him, and therefore we can take advantage of his good nature." Not necessarily in terms of a relationship, but in terms of money, influence, introductions that all of that could bring. So I think that it wasn't just about a thrill or being able to brag. I think it was calculated to the degree of, what can I get out of this?
interesting because she does write to her aunt after the first meeting where she says something like, "Oh, I met the Prince of Wales last night, and as you can imagine, that's exactly the sort of thing I want to be doing." Or some, I'm paraphrasing, but she says something that if you read it back knowing what happened, you could read an agenda into it quite early on. But I'm not sure. But you could also just as equally read it as this, you know me, this exact sort of thing I like to do. A bit like a Tara
But I,
London-y
but I
kind of.
do think you can go too far in reading the agenda into it, because I don't for a moment think that Wallace met him with the intention of wanting to marry him, wanting to divorce Ernest Simpson, wanting to be queen. I think that people have read that into it. I think that is too far, and there are too many things which could have gone wrong for that to have been
Yeah,
her goal.
it
But
just
I
wouldn't have
do
been.
think
It
it
wouldn't
was.
have been a credible plan. I mean, it
No,
just doesn't. As a sane person, there's no way you can think
yeah,
that would have been her plan in
no.
1934.
But I do
But
think that there was a sense of wanting to meet him for what you could get out of it. I think that is fair to say.
I think that may have come a bit later. I think my general take is when they first met in the early 1930s, it was just a case of this is great. These are the exact sort of circles I want to be moving in. This is good. When a little later on, and Lady Finesse asks her to step up her involvement because she's worried that Edward's getting bored with the social circle, and she wants engaging people like Wallace to be in his orbit. I think then is probably more where she senses an opportunity to really use this as as a tool for social advancement, whatever that looked like, and then quite quickly became something romantic, stroke sexual, stroke something else. I don't think it was ever her game plan to marry. I think when it became clearer that that's what he was pushing for, she could see that there's a way it could work for her. But I don't think it was ever her game plan. I don't think she was ever particularly looking to move on from Ernest. They seemed to have a pretty good understanding, which accommodated extramarital liaisons, particularly if they
Yes, and
were
it
of
has
the
to be
material
pointed out on both
benefit.
sides.
Yeah.
It has to be pointed out extramarital liaisons on both sides, because I think that again, people paint Wallace as some kind of scarlet woman and Ernest Simpson as some terrible, wronged cuckold. And again, I think that that's unfair. He was documented, or certainly documented later, to be having relationships with other women. I think that it was, and it doesn't seem to be any real sense of animosity between the two of them. It was just sort of understood. And although it might be difficult for some of us to understand that type of relationship and the dynamic within that relationship, it does seem that it was sort of understood and accepted by both parties.
Yeah, which is quite upper class, isn't it? Just to make
I
a
wouldn't
huge
know,
sweeping
darling. I'm sure
statement.
you would.
I don't know that I
You
would.
you move in those circles more than I do.
I do not move in any of those circles. Um, so another question from Michelle on YouTube. Do you know where the rumours about Wallace receiving carnations from Ribbentrop originated? There was supposed to be evidence of the affair. Yes, they were. So the tale is that he would regularly send Wallace. So, sorry, Ribbentrop was the German ambassador in the 1930s. He would supposedly send Wallace 17 carnations on a regular basis. And each carnation was meant to symbolize a time that they had slept together, which I think most people thought at the time even was perhaps slightly a fanciful construction. However, there were very serious concerns that Ribbentrop and Wallace had been lovers. These were concerns recorded by intelligence agencies. So we're not talking tittle tattle here. And I think that's really important to remember. It's not just that, oh, there was a bit of gossip. It was concerns recorded and noted by intelligence agencies who had Wallace marked from an early stage as someone who was fascist, linked to fascism in some way or another, and was a potential a troublesome actor in the political scene of the 1930s. So I think what we would have to say with all of that is, although it doesn't come down to us just through tittle tattle and gossip, it may be that the intelligence services discovered some of this, or believed they discovered some of this through tittle tattle and gossip. So I don't know if we can attest to it as entirely reliable. And there are other stories that seem a bit fanciful, that apparently Wallace kept a photograph of Ribbentrop on her bedside table for the rest of her life. But it's all connected to an association that people feared Wallace had with Nazi Germany, and that it may have been sealed with more than a kiss, put it that way.
Well, that's a very delicate way of putting it.
Well, I'm very delicate.
Yeah, I think that it's difficult to draw into it simply because the very nature of having an illicit relationship like that is the fact that a lot of it is done behind closed doors. You have to be pretty blatant to try and flaunt a relationship like that. And as you say, this does come to us through intelligence agencies, but their intelligence gathering was done largely through gossip, through sources. It wasn't necessarily through any concrete proof. It was that somebody had seen them together at a certain point, or that there were rumours that they had been that they'd been close. And also, you have to remember that by this time, Wallace would have had plenty of people who would have not been well disposed to her, who would have been able to believe the worst of her. And so, you look at all of the stories about what she'd got up to in China before she met Edward. So I think that you have to bear that in mind as well. I'm not saying she didn't have an affair with von Ribbentrop. I'm just saying that because a lot of the sources are based on the sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink gossip, it's very difficult to be able to draw a conclusion to that.
It's certainly difficult to draw a conclusion. Again, it's tricky. A few people have said on social media to me, all this is always done to discredit Wallace. We can't take it seriously. She had so many enemies. And I get that. And to an extent, I think that's true. But I think what we have to remember is when a lot of this stuff is being discussed between intelligence agencies as war is breaking out, these people are busy. They've got a lot to do. And they are trying to defend people's lives. They're trying to create an intelligence environment that's going to allow for military success. They are busy. So if they are spending time talking about Wallace, now Duchess of Windsor, and speculating and gathering evidence that they either previously observed or trying to find out what happened in the past, they're not just doing it because they want to discredit, an unsuitable royal bride. They haven't got time for anything like that. They clearly will only be doing this if they genuinely believe that Wallace Simpson, and at this stage it's Wallace rather than Edward. It will later be Edward much more, but at this stage it seems to be Wallace. That Wallace is a very, very dangerous link between someone who may have access to some sort of sensitive information and the Nazi enemies. And they're not necessarily right. That doesn't make them right. But I think we have to take it very seriously that this was never stuff intended to be put into the public domain. It was never stuff that the Secret Service are not bothered, frankly, about the social reputation of the royal family at this stage. What they're worried about is the triumph of the Allied forces, and the fact that Wallace gets mentioned in that context, I think, is significant.
Well, it's because there's a potential security risk, isn't there?
Yeah.
And not just in terms of Edward and Wallace. I mean, in terms of collaboration with the Nazis, and therefore, if the king were to be captured, would Edward be put in as a puppet king, and was Wallace seen as the backdoor negotiator?
Yeah.
All of those things were very credible worries at the time. So I think that one shouldn't dismiss any of this. Or my point is simply that because a lot of it is based on rumor, conjecture, admittedly carried out by the intelligence service, but talking to people, and that's where they were finding their sources, and they did their source criticism. They were acknowledging that they were not simply taking it all at face value. But I think that you have to just remember where some of that information was coming from, and not draw too much into it as well.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, and we're going to come and talk a bit more about the sort of Nazi fascist element in a second. It's something that deserves a whole examination.
I think it's far easier to be able to prove that Wallace and Edward had sympathies with fascists than it is to prove that she was actually having an extramarital affair with von Ribbentrop. The first is quite general, but the second is much more specific, and so I think that's the line I would draw.
Yes, I think that's reasonable. Michelle also asked, and this is in relation to something we said in our I think it was second or third episode. We had when we talked about Edward and Wallace's Balkans cruise, or Edward's Balkans cruise in the summer of 1936, that Wallace joined him on. We were talking about how surely Ernest Simpson must have been there as a chaperone, or else it would have looked awful. But we couldn't find any evidence that he had been. And Michelle says, "Didn't excuse me? Didn't Bessie Merriman, which is Wallace's aunt, accompany Wallace on the Balkans cruise as a chaperone? I think they used that Ernest had to work as an excuse." So the truth is, I still don't know who exactly was there because it's very hard to find out, and you can understand that because it wasn't an official thing where would there be lists published of who was there. Looking at the pictures and any mention I could find, I can't find any mention of Ernest Simpson being there, and I can't see any pictures or mention of Bessie Merriman being there either, which isn't to say she wasn't or that he wasn't. I just can't find it. However, Wallace's good friend Catherine Rogers and her husband were there, and they took a lot of the pictures, and that's where a lot of the pictures we have came from their personal collection. And it may be that even though they were a couple, it may be that that was felt that the group was big enough not to require a sort of chaperoning of a woman there in her own right, because the group was big enough to not make it seem like it was just a set of couples. I just don't know, but we've still not really been able to find a satisfactory answer to that.
No, and I would just draw that parallel to there was the famous portrait, photograph of Princess Margaret and Roddy Llewellyn in Mustique that was published in, was it 1978, just at the time, just before her divorce from Lord Snowdon. And it was quite an intimate picture of them sat at a picnic. But of course, it was cropped from a much larger group, so it looked as though it was far more intimate than it actually was. And I think that there's an element of that in what we see with the images of Edward and Wallace.
Yeah, there's definitely images of a wider party being there, and you, I can't see in those pictures Ernest Simpson um, or Bessie Merriman. They could say, well, maybe they were taking the pictures, but it looks like it's the Rogers taking the pictures because normally only one of them is in it. So it looks like that's probably what's happening. But who knows? Next
But it's fair
question.
to say they were chaperoned. They were not there alone.
They certainly weren't there alone. And this, I don't know enough about the chaperoning customs of the day to know at what stage a woman needed to be chaperoned. If there was just a group, was that okay?
I think it was. I think it's only if a married or even an unmarried woman was there with an unmarried man that it was seen as being
Yeah,
very
okay.
delicate. But if you were part of a much wider party, then that was seen as being socially acceptable. Now, it might have been slightly different with Edward Wallace, with him being the king and with her being married to somebody else and all of that. So, all of that is heightened. But I think essentially, if you are part of a group, then you can both go to the same places and do the same things, and it's seen as being socially acceptable as long as you're not just being seen as being there on your own.
And certainly Bessie Merriman is used as a chaperoning figure later that year, because when the king moves Wallace into Fort Belvedere, worried about her safety, Bessie moves with them. So there's there's certainly evidence of her in that role. Whereas if the king just moves a woman in, that looks very dodgy. If he takes in an aunt and her niece who are in trouble, that's nice. So I guess that's the sort of spirit of these things.
How very magnanimous of him to have done that.
Yeah, he's a very magnanimous man. Magnanimous is one of those words I can never say. How do you say it? I can never.
Magnanimous.
Magnanimous. Do you have words you just can't say for no real reason?
Yes, I do sometimes. Yes.
Yeah, magnanimous.
For years, I couldn't say in the midst of something. I kept saying in the midst of something, but
In the midst of, yeah, that's hard word. That's hard. I can't say specific very well either. I often say Pacific.
Well, do you know, it's funny. It's funny. I was a guest on the radio once, and I was in reviewing the newspapers, and there was somebody reading the news, and normally people say Pacific when they mean specific.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, specifically this. Well, it was the other way around, because they were talking about about a vessel in the Pacific Ocean, not in the Pacific Ocean.
Bless him. Next question. This is a really meaty one again, which probably deserves a whole other exploration. But from Mama Misters on YouTube, says, "I'm curious on your thoughts about the Duke's time in the Bahamas, and particularly his role in the murder investigation of Sir Harry Oakes. It seems like a really interesting topic." Well, it is, and I've been trying to, because we were focusing really early up until the end of 36. I've been trying to do a little deep dive on that this week. And so just so I'm not claiming to be an expert on this topic, but I'm just going to give everyone a quick overview, and maybe it's something we'll come back to at another time. So, as we, I think, already know, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were dispatched to the Bahamas in 1940 to get them out of Europe because they were seen as troublemakers. The Duke is made governor of the Bahamas. There's a very wealthy chap there called Sir Harry Oakes, who is a controversial figure, property developer. He gets murdered in his sleep, it would seem. The Duke says rather than go to the local police who aren't used, and this is probably fair, who aren't used to dealing with high profile crimes of this nature, I'm going to go and look to America because it's a bit too far for anyone from Scotland Yard in London to send anyone with a war going on. But America's quite nearby. However, whereas should normally have gone to something like the FBI or a more recognised, basically what I'm trying to say is it seems that there was a recognised way that if the Bahamas needed help from America, there was a recognised channel they should go through. He doesn't. He just approaches some sort of cops he sort of knows who are quite not particularly expert in this situation. He brings them over. It seems like they've got a remit to just sort this out quickly. They frame the son-in-law of Sir Harry Oakes, who had probably motive. He didn't get on with his father-in-law. They had a bad relationship for some quite understandable reasons. They frame him. They fake fingerprints and all the rest of it. And eventually it doesn't stand up in court because it's too rushed, a botched job, and it all falls to pieces. The son-in-law is exonerated, and we do not know to this day who killed Sir Harry Oakes. It would only have been possible, and this is pretty clear from a few bits of evidence, for these police who Edward brought in to manage such a botched job with his at least tacit approval, if not personal involvement. And although Edward and Wallace were very keen to say, "Oh, we never got involved at all in the case," there's some evidence that they did, and there's some evidence that they may even have known who was really responsible for the murder. The fact that it is quite clear, people would argue that that's the case, has led others to say Edward must have been covering up for a friend of his. And there's one particular chap who's mentioned as someone that was giving the Windsors quite a bit of money or was going to give them some money, who Edward was probably trying to protect. That's possible. And there's even some that said, oh, maybe it was Edward himself, and that's why he was so keen to cover everything up. I think that's possible. I also think it's possible that Edward thought this needs to be sorted quickly because it's very bad for tourism, which was a big thing in the Bahamas. The local police won't be able to do it. I want to have control of this. I want it shut down quickly. Start bringing some people I sort of know who will do what I say. And it's just a complete botched job, terrible way of handling a situation, terrible errors of judgment from Edward, which have been typical of his career to date. I don't know that it necessarily means he was involved in a sinister cover up, but that's possible too.
No, but because he acted in the way he did by bringing in two individuals that were known to him personally, he led himself wide open to that interpretation, whether it's true or it isn't. And one can understand why an investigation of that nature might have been too large an undertaking for the local police force on an island like the Bahamas at the time.
Yes, I think
And
that's
one can-
I think that is
No,
reasonable.
I think that's reasonable, and I think it's also reasonable not to have brought in the Metropolitan Police, given that there was a Second World War was raging at the time. So, and I can understand that, but I think the fact that he went through these backdoor channels to bring in those individuals that were known to him, even if he had nothing at all to do with the murder or even the cover up itself, it does leave him. He left himself wide open to those accusations because he acted unwisely, and I think that sadly that's rather typical of his nature and his kingship. So.
Quite. So it's always so easy, isn't it, to assume a sinister agenda when sometimes it's just good plain old fashioned incompetence, and that does happen. Next question from Laura on YouTube says, Which is a great question. I'm just curious as to how and why Edward would have had access to sensitive information after he abdicated. It seems like once he was no longer king, there would have been no reason for him to be informed of sensitive details or particulars, or was he thought to have passed such information along to the enemy before this? I think, and this is because, so on the episode last week, because I re-listened to it, I said twice, I used the phrase sensitive information that Edward was deemed to potentially be passing on to the Nazis. And I think it's probably worth just clarifying what we mean by that, because I think you're absolutely right, Laura. Post abdication, there is no need for Edward to be seeing sensitive intelligence information. And frankly, even as king, I'm not sure he would necessarily have been shown those things. However, he was at the beginning of World War II given an honorary military rank, as royals tended to be. And I think just because of things like, oh, let's put him to use, he was doing things like he was inspecting some French troops, he was meeting with some French officials, and he seems, well, he almost certainly tells a Nazi informant. Arguably, he doesn't know this chap's a Nazi informant. I think that's possible. He tells the Nazi informant that he doesn't think basically France can withstand an attack by Germany. He gives them information, which some argue they then went on to use as part of their strategy for invading France. Difficult to know exactly what went on there. Similarly, he later is relocated to Portugal. It seems pretty clear that the Nazis are aware of exactly where the Windsors are going to go, what they're up to, and allow, if you like, facilitate that move. But they seem to know very specific details of where they are, suggesting there's a back channel there at this point. And perhaps most controversially, there is a belief that Edward, probably without realizing what he was doing, gave Nazi agents sensitive information about the layout of Buckingham Palace, which may have helped them know exactly where to bomb when they dropped the bombs on Buckingham Palace in 1940. And it's really around this time the government saying, get these two out of Europe and send them to the Bahamas. What we know from archives that were opened in the decades after the war is that various German sources, including the German ambassador in Portugal, claimed they are having conversations with the Duke of Windsor. They claimed he was saying things to them like, my belief is that after a bit of bombing, Britain will give in. So this is what you need to do. And gave them, and that there was some tacit agreement that the Duke of Windsor might be interested potentially in becoming a puppet king, etc., if Hitler managed to conquer Britain. We will never know because it comes to us sort of third hand or second hand at least, how true those conversations were, how much nuance might have been changed in the detailing of that. I always think with the one about um, Edward saying, "Oh, bomb Britain," we don't know if he was saying, "This is what I recommend you do. They won't stand out for long, so do this round of bombings, then they'll give in," or whether it's more of a whole, "Oh, Britain's so weak these days, they probably won't withstand much bombing." To be honest, you just don't know exactly how the comments were offered, if they were offered at all. It could have all been manufactured.
And the other thing I would say is that even if those comments were made, it's still based on a lot of seems, not on hard because he was not being given a lot of evidence, a lot of sensitive information to actually pass on. A lot of it is based on his interpretations, on his judgment, which they may have put more weight on than they deserve to have, quite honestly.
I think that's true. I mean, I think the problem with having Edward and Wallace in Europe was they're just closer to Germany, so they're more likely to come across Nazi agents, but also because of the status that they had, and this would be, I think, true in France in the run up to the war, the crowds they would mix in would know stuff. So they probably were mixing among the French elite. I don't massively know this. I have to say I don't know what their dinner party guest list looked like, but it's obviously not inconceivable that senior members of the French military would have been in their social circle at various points. So I just think they were dangerous from that point of view. And I think we need to look more closely at the Nazi involvement, because some people read some of the source material that I've just talked about and say you just have to take this as read that he was helping the Germans, and that he would have been, he would, if he hadn't been the Duke of Windsor, he would have been executed. Others say, well, actually, in the same way that, for me as a historian more of the 15th and 16th century, we're very cautious with the way we use the source material on, say, Anne Boleyn that comes to us from Chappé, who's the imperial ambassador, because we know there's a lot going on there. And that is the same sort of format that a lot of the intelligence on the Windsors comes to us from. All I would say is the Germans are claiming he's sympathetic. Based on other evidence, the British and US forces believe he's sympathetic. So if he wasn't sympathetic and in some ways aiding the Nazis during World War II, then he is the most misunderstood man in history by all sides.
But I suppose there's a difference between being sympathetic and actually giving information which would be valuable to them. And that's really what we don't know to be the case. We know that he's having conversations, but whether they're conversations which actually would have led to the downfall of the UK and led to the establishment of Nazism in the UK in the event of an invasion, that's where I think that it's more difficult to be able to make an accurate conclusion.
And there are other views that Wallace was putting these Nazi informants in front of him, and she knew they were Nazi informants and he didn't. It's just very, very difficult to know, and I suspect that we never will now, unless someone discovers some other archive of lots of handwritten letters that can be verified as the Duke of Windsor saying, "Let's go and destroy Britain. I'll be king," and you know, we're not going to probably get much more evidence. So Hacken, again, apologies if my pronunciation is wrong, on Facebook said, "Who today would sacrifice their personal happiness in order to keep up appearances? King Edward was ahead of his time." Now, I don't know to the extent that's a question or a statement really, but I disagree with that because I think it misunderstands what was going on in 1936. Let me say something quite controversial now.
You say something controversial.
I know. Even though I do believe that Mrs. Simpson and the king's desire to marry her was the reason Edward abdicated, I believe, and I don't how I'll never be able to prove this, if all it had been about for Edward was wanting to marry Mrs. Simpson, I think he could have done it. I think if he'd taken the Duff Cooper, Winston Churchill school of advice, where he'd let it lie, let her divorce go through quietly, got crowned, she went overseas for a year or two, came back, and they got married in a sort of morganatic marriage, whether it's technically morganatic or not, but she wouldn't be called queen. I think they could have got away with it if the dust had settled. The reason I think Edward abdicated, therefore, is less about because he couldn't marry her and more about because he couldn't do exactly what he wanted when he wanted on his terms. And he wasn't interested in being king in a constitutional setup that meant he had to work within very specific parameters. So no, I don't see his abdication as an act of progressive, encouraging, aspirational, future relevant, I don't know, celebration. I think it was an act that just proved he wasn't right to be king. Put it that way.
Yeah, and also I think that to say that who would sacrifice somebody today, sacrifice their personal happiness to keep appearances today, that does make the assumption that we live in a much more progressive society, which in some ways we perhaps do than we did 90 years ago. But at the same time,
yeah.
Well, but I was just going to say that. But at the same time, though, being permissive is not necessarily a linear.
No.
There are times where it's more like a pendulum where things are seen as being more liberal, more progressive, and then are seen as being less so. And so I think that looking at it in the wider context of history, there are times when it would have been celebrated that a king had given up the throne for his mistress because it's a great love affair and it's seen as triumphing over their circumstances. But then equally, there are other times in history where that would have been seen as a great dereliction of duty. And
Mm.
one can see why Queen Mary said to her son that so many of his generation had made sacrifices during the war, had been killed or at least badly injured, and yet he was not willing to make a sacrifice for his country. And so, coming from that post First World War
Mm.
environment, you can see why people would have shared Queen Mary's view there.
Yeah.
So I think that it's not fair to say that today that he's being seen ahead of his time, because I think that assumes that the attitude will stay the same, and I don't think it necessarily will. We could say we could record this in 10 years time, and attitudes would have changed towards relationships, towards mental health, towards any of those things, and the context in which we were discussing it would have changed, and so therefore you wouldn't necessarily draw that same conclusion.
Yes, I guess what people are saying is, yeah, of course we all make sacrifices, but being asked to sacrifice the person you love more in the world just to satisfy a kind of moral sensibility is too much to ask for someone, which I can understand that. But I think, had it been a case that, as I said, I think there probably would have been a different path anyway. But also, I think, had it just been that, and he said, "No, I must marry this woman," too much to bear, all the rest of it, and he then did so, and then left and lived a quiet life, I think people would probably think, yeah, okay, fair enough. A bit like, I remember talking to my gran about this. She was only about 10 at the time. And I said, she never really liked to talk about the past particularly. And she was a royalist, I guess, but not in the way I was. And I said to her, "What did you all make?" She said, "Oh, well, we all just felt quite sorry for him, really," which isn't the same as saying we thought he could stay. But people did get the human aspect of it. I think one of the reasons we look at him so negatively is that he then went on to probably betray the UK in the Second World War and encourage a German invasion. That's quite big stuff. It's not Prince Harry writing a slightly sensational book. It's actually trying to get people to kill British citizens. That's really, I think, the reason the royal family could never really forgive him, and the reason many historians can't. So I don't know that it's as simple as, wasn't he just a great romantic? Had he just had the romantic bit and then went on and did really productive stuff. And if you take the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, to use a modern example, now we've talked about this, I don't agree with many of the ways they've chosen to make public statements, but I do fully accept that they now are going on to do productive, constructive things. Not everyone will approve what they do, of course not. And they're trying to make a good contribution to humanity. And as a result, one day people will judge the whole Mexit thing as a storm in a teacup. And if the Windsors had gone on to have a good war and a good productive life, I think people would view it as a romantic tragedy and have a lot of sympathy, but they didn't, so we don't.
No, very true, very true.
Next question. We're conscious, yes, but we've got a lot more questions to fit in. This could end up being a bit of a bumper episode. So again, sorry if pronunciations are not quite right, but Shidoop NYC asks I didn't write that down. I assume that was on Instagram, I think. What communications with the US government during this crisis? I assume you mean between the Duke of Windsor when he was in the Bahamas, and the States. FDR and Churchill were all in the special relationship bromance. So basically, I think during the war, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor went to the US 4 times. FDR didn't want them to. I think there was a sense the British government didn't want them to. FDR didn't want them to, but they went anyway. And when they were there, the US government had them very closely followed by intelligence operatives. So I don't think there was any appetite to see the Windsors there. I don't know that no one wanted to end anywhere because they had some public influence and they were anti-war. And that's not the spirit you need when there's a war going on. So I think that the idea with the Bahamas is they're very far from Europe. They're quite hard to get anywhere. It's the safest place. We can, and they did not want to be there, which is like governor of the Bahamas. That would be like a brilliant job, I would have thought, but they did not see it that way. Wallis, I think, to her credit, did do some productive work running a canteen for soldiers. So, and the Duke did a not very good job of trying to run the island, but I don't think the US had any appetite for Wallace. Do you know any different, James?
No, I think that's right. I think it's also fair to say that you have to remember that George VI and Queen Elizabeth had paid a very successful state visit to the United States in 1939 as well, and so they had developed another working relationship with the Roosevelts, with both FDR and with Eleanor Roosevelt, and so I think that there was that personal level as well as with Churchill.
Next question then. So Dean via email said, if Edward had stayed as king, what role do you think Princess Elizabeth would have carried out within the royal family? James, what do you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting one, that one, because, of course, Princess Elizabeth, assuming that the Windsors hadn't any children, as they didn't have, it would have been Princess Elizabeth would naturally have been the next heir after her father, and so assuming that her father had died at the same time that he did, she would have been the heir presumptive, and so therefore it's interesting to judge how close she would have been. Would it have been that he would have treated her like the daughter that he didn't have, and that he would have been extremely affectionate, and that he would have given her the chance to learn at Nellie's elbow, I believe is the expression. Or would it have been that there'd have been this sense of antipathy between him because of his relationship with Wallace and her parents, so they would have been kept apart in the same way that Victoria was not at court during the reign of her uncle William IV. I mean, obviously it's rather different because Victoria was only 18 when her uncle died, but she was kept away from the coronation when her younger cousin Augusta went. Queen Mary's grandmother was allowed to go to the coronation in 1831. So would it have been that type of thing? I think it's very difficult to say. I think it entirely depends on the state of the relationship between her parents and the Windsors, what role she would have played. But whether she would have carried out more of an official role at that under his reign, it has to be remembered that she would automatically have been the heir, so she would automatically have inherited anyway. So in that sense, nothing would have changed. But the extent to which her parents and the Windsors would have been friendly and would have encouraged a relationship with their niece, that's what I think is open to question.
And I guess the real thing is, what would have been very different is if the Windsors had had children, or Edward VIII and Queen Wallis had children, because then Elizabeth would have been a sort of Princess Alexandra figure that maybe did a little bit of royal. I mean, Princess Alexandra's done more, probably been a working royal more than would have been expected given her normal station because of a lack of female members of the royal family in the sort of 60s era. But she would have perhaps led the sort of country life that she'd always supposedly wanted to have led. I think it's just worth saying, so I don't think this is going to come up elsewhere, there are many historians who believe that Wallace and Edward couldn't have children. There are some theories that, I mean, partly, of course, by the time they meet, by the standards of the day, they're quite old, but people did still have kids at that age.
Well, you've got to remember Wallace was 40 in 1936, which again, I'm not saying is too old, because my grandma gave birth to my mum in 1944 when she was 42. So, women did have babies in their 40s, in the 30s and in the 1940s. So it wouldn't have been terrible pun, inconceivable. But naturally, you have to recognise that leaving aside any other potential issues, the age issue itself is enough of a factor for you to think this is less and less likely.
It's a factor, and then the other theories people have. One is that Wallace knew after an abortion earlier in her life, she knew herself to be infertile, which is a possibility, and that supposedly is one of the reasons she felt comfortable being slightly more sexually explorative, because she didn't feel that an unwanted pregnancy was ever a risk. There is also the view among some that Edward and Wallace didn't practice a conventional sexual relationship, therefore conception would have not been possible. I don't really know how anyone can know that, to be honest, but it is more than one person thinks it, put it that way.
And also those rumours that Wallace was intersex as well, which again
Yes.
is again, how can anyone really know that? I think that
Well, I guess
that level of
if you'd been a lover of Wallace, you possibly could know it.
yes, well, possibly, but
Depending, yes, depending on
yes,
the
but
nature.
what I mean is that where would that be documented is what I would say,
Yeah.
and how credible are things like that to, when somebody has been vilified in the way that Wallace undoubtedly was, there are a lot of things which are said to discredit them, and so that's where I find things like that difficult to be able to form a judgment on,
Yeah.
because I'm not sure that the source material really you're able to form any kind of judgment on it.
No, I agree. It doesn't. And in one sense, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I don't get me wrong. I think anyone's allowed to ask whatever questions of our history that they want to. But all we need to know is that they didn't have kids and they didn't. It doesn't really matter why.
No, it doesn't really. The reason why doesn't really make a difference. It's
Not
not the
really.
same as say. Well, no, I mean it's not the same as say Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, where you would discuss why so many of their children had died either at birth or shortly afterwards. Was there a medical condition which had caused that? Whereas here, it was of no consequence to the rest of the history. So therefore, there's less impetus for us to want to know.
Yes. I feel a bit bad because Martin on email has asked, did Edward Wallace have any children? Was there ever a desire to have any? We've basically just answered that.
We have, but we've never heard of a desire for them to have children either. They didn't give interviews saying, "I wish I'd had children."
No,
So I
yeah,
think
no,
that's
they
difficult
didn't.
to be
They
able to
didn't.
judge as well.
Yeah, they didn't, and we'll never know what happens. I mean, obviously, Wallace had been married twice before without children, which is perhaps another argument that supports infertility, but also it doesn't necessarily. I mean, like
Well,
Catherine
look,
Parr, of
Catherine
course,
Parr,
well, yeah,
yes,
had three husbands and no child, and on the fourth husband fell pregnant almost straight away. So, yeah, you can't know. But Martin also asked, was there ever a desire to live in Germany and set up home there as they had a big alliance with the Germans? It's a good question. And then I don't know if there was ever a desire. I don't think it would have been feasible because by the time Edward abdicated, tensions were already too high. I just don't think he could have got away with that to the extent that I think, and you might say, well, why would he care what anyone thinks? Well, I think that would have been allowance removing territory. And remember that the king was granting Edward an annuity, and the government wanted the king to be doing so because it at least gave them a string they could cut if they really needed to with the Windsors. Clearly not that effective a strategy, but I think going to live in Germany would have been a step too far. What do you think, James?
well, I agree, but I also think you have to remember that there might have been the hope that Edward would have, when the dust had settled, be able to have some kind of official position. I don't think that's
Yes.
really very credible, but I think that he believed that that might have been, and so for him to have wanted to go and live in Germany, I think would have belied that. However, I will caveat that by saying that if he had been offered an official residence and official position by the Germans, that might have been different. I'm not saying that he would necessarily have taken it, but I think that there's a difference between him being sought out and offered something than him actively
Yeah.
seeking it.
Yeah, and of course, from the Germans' point of view, he was far more useful to them not in Germany than he would have been in Germany in the
Well, yes,
run
because
to World
you
War
can't
Two.
have somebody who is you're wanting to get state secrets from if they're not in or around the circles in which they can
Yes.
find out that
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. So Martin also asks, could they have shot Edward? He acted like a blatant traitor, really. I think that's an interesting point, and we did talk about in episode 2, we did talk about that botched shooting of Edward at Trooping of the Colour, and there being some theories, which are probably not hugely credible, but tantalizingly open, that suggested the Secret Services could have been sort of involved in some sort of attempt to bring Edward VIII down. So I wouldn't say it's completely uncredible, but generally speaking, I think it would not have been a strategy Churchill would ever have agreed to. It wouldn't have been a strategy George VI would ever have agreed to. So I'm not sure how the secrets. They obviously could legally do it, so it'd have to be a Secret Service assassination. Joel, which did happen. What
Well, I
do you
suppose
think?
the other thing would be if he'd been convicted of treason for
Yes,
war crimes or something. Again, I think that having him executed would have been would have created too much of a martyr, or there's the
I
potential
agree.
to have
I
created a
agree.
martyr, and so that's why I don't think it was likely by the 1930s or the 1940s that that would have been a strategy that they would have used. I think they might have wanted him out of the way, which is why he was sent to the Bahamas. But I think to to have gone down that route of executing him, I think would not necessarily have served either the king or Churchill well at that
Uh,
point.
I agree, and I think that we have to remember the overriding view seems to have been that containing and covering up what the Windsors were up to was actually better for the British state and better for the royal family than exposing it. We tend to think, partly again, because we see things like, oh, are the palace going to brief this against Harry and Meghan or whatever today? And whereas actually the view seems to be that anything that dragged the Windsors down would drag the whole House of Windsor down, rather
Yes.
than just sort of show that they're all separate, kind of thing. Neil via email us, what kind of relationship did Edward have with his mother, Queen Mary? I mean, we talked about that pretty extensively, didn't we, in the episode on the royal family? But is there anything you wanted
We
to
did.
add to that, James?
Well, not add to it, but I think to summarize, I think it was a difficult relationship. I think that they had been very close as he was a young child, and I know that people say that Queen Mary was seen as being very frosty with her children, and I think that's true to an extent. But he did talk himself about how she would take all the children into her boudoir, that they would have time with her individually, that she taught them singing and sewing and all of those pastimes. So I think that there had been great warmth and affection as a young child. But I think that the letter that Queen Mary wrote to him a couple of years after the abdication, that about her sense of duty and that he didn't share it, I think that that relationship was ultimately fractured. However, she didn't stop having a kindness and affection towards him. He did come and meet her several times in London after the war, and also she did inquire after Wallace's health. So she was not seen as being deliberately malicious towards Wallace either. I'm not saying that there was ever a closeness. She never received her, but again, she didn't ignore the fact that he was married. So I think that there was an attempt on Queen Mary's part to at least keep up that friendly and that warm relationship to the extent that she could. And certainly that can't have been easy for Queen Mary, given the antipathy between the Windsors and George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and certainly in that year after George VI's death between Queen Elizabeth and the Windsors then. So I think that Queen Mary can be credited for trying to have sustained that relationship as well as she probably could have done in those circumstances.
The Helen has asked a question about the relationship between the Nazis and the Windsors, and I think we've covered that. So sorry, Helen, to preempt your question.
Helena.
Helena, I'm so sorry. Emily via email, this is our last question. Says what would Edward have made to Harry's marriage to an American divorcee? I think it's interesting. I think he would have considered himself a trailblazer that perhaps paved the way for that. But all I would say on this is I understand why people make parallels between the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, but they are not the same. Partly because, of course, Harry was never king and was never going to be king, but also, and I do disagree with the way the Sussex have conducted the decisions they have made, but fundamentally, I do believe they are people that want to do good in the world and found that the way you have to do good in royalty didn't work for them. And I think that is true, although I really disagree with some of the ways they've chosen to go about managing their exit. With Edward and Wallace, it's just that the constraints of royalty didn't allow for them to indulge their personal happiness in the way that they wanted to. And I don't think the comparisons are true. And however much I think Harry's been small t treacherous for some of the things he says about his brother and his father that are personal, he has not been capital T treacherous in terms of actually trying to get British citizens killed, which I think the Duke of Windsor probably did.
No, and he's not acted in any way to try and bring down the monarchies. He's acted in a way to embarrass his father and his brother on a personal level. But I don't think that Prince Harry has ever actually tried to bring about the downfall of the House of Windsor. I think that's too far. I think you can draw some conclusions because I think that the way in which they conduct themselves does lead to some type of comparison, with the sort of the antipathy and the way in which they have given certain interviews and the way in which he's written about his family. I think that there are similarities there, but I think you can overplay it because, as you say, Harry was never king. He was never going to be king, and also you can read too much into the being American and being divorcee too, because I think that a lot of that is coincidental rather than there being a strategy that therefore you must act in the same way. I think that, and also you have to remember that Meghan was welcome. Well, you can Prince Harry would debate the extent to which she was welcome. What I mean is that they were allowed to get married. She did have the title Her Royal Highness. She did carry out royal engagements in this country.
Yeah.
Things obviously went sour for them, and that's when they did leave. But there was never the same type of rejection that Edward and Wallace received. So I think that you can draw too many. You can go too far by looking for comparisons.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like Harry and Meghan were bought in, but found out that being in didn't work for them. Edward and Wallace wanted to be back in to some extent, and were told, "No, you can't be." That is the end of.
Well, it's almost the end, but I've got another question before we go. Will no one think of the debutantes?
Will no one think of the debutantes? No one will. No one has. The debutantes are gone.
Well, you have
quite
frequently.
The day will come when the debutantes will revive themselves in our affections. But that is for now the end of this episode. It is the end of the formal part of the Abdication series. Thank you for journeying with us. There are at least two more bonus episodes to come, so look out for those, but we'll have a little bit of a break. We will have another series of royal revolutions at some stage. So if you think there's a revolution we could cover, we're bouncing around ideas, the Glorious Revolution, Wars of the Roses, there's the Norman there's all sorts of things we could do. Or we could look at some royal storms in the teacup instead, like the bedchamber crisis, Queen Victoria. We've already looked at Harry and Meghan. So let us know any ideas, and also keep your eyes on the General Royal History Geeks podcast because there'll be other content coming soon. But we've loved being with you all. James, thank you so much for all your hard work, charm, and articulate presentation of history in this podcast.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to you, and thank you for having me. I always enjoy. It's always a joy to be able to record and to be able to have somebody that you can bounce ideas off and just it's just really enjoyable to be able to have the opportunities to be able to do these, and I'm pleased that people have been listening to them as well, and that they've also enjoyed them.
Thank you all so much for your engagement. I know the episodes are long and we go on, but I've really appreciated people's questions, people's really kind comments, giving us thoughts, giving us things to check and research. And once again, the Royal History Geeks have proved that they are the most super cool people on the face of this earth. Until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye.